Good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes, but first let's do a video and audio check for everyone that has already signed in. If you can see our beautiful faces of our panelists and the slide right below that says the state of early talent recruiting, and you can hear the sound of my voice, please make sure to say hello in the chat box so that we know you're there. And if you have any trouble, just let us know. We'll be right back with you in a couple of minutes. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to everyone that's on the East Coast. I hope you're all doing well today. Happy Thursday. Myself and the panelists are quite excited to be here with you. We're going to talk about the state of early talent recruiting and how employers, students, and higher ed are all responding to COVID-19 today. To begin, let me introduce you to each of our panelists. We're going to give you a quick overview on some of the data and insights today before we get into our panel. First, we have Rose Nakamoto. She's our Chief Career Development Officer at Santa Clara University and a wonderful colleague and friend to Handshake. We have Walter Fellers, the Global Head of University Recruiting with Goldman Sachs. I hope you're doing well today, Walter. We have William Jones, or Will, as we like to affectionately call him, who is our Senior Director of Career Exploration and Success at Rutgers University. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Christine Cruz-Vergara. I'm the VP of Higher Education and Student Success here at Handshake. We're delighted to be here with you today. And first, let me just run through the agenda so you know how the panel will flow. First, we have obviously done our welcome and introductions. We're now going to go into some of our newly released insights for employers, students, and higher education. We want to ground the conversation today in some of the data that we've been able to collect, and we want to make sure that we share that with you so you can use it within your own companies, organizations, or institutions. And then we're going to go into a really lively discussion with these three wonderful individuals around the ongoing impact of COVID-19, how their own institutions or companies are dealing with it, but even broader in terms of the different sectors and areas that they work in. And most importantly, we're going to spend some time really looking into the future. So with that, we're going to have some Q&A at the end with all of our panelists. Now, before I jump into our data and insights, let me actually just do a little bit of housekeeping now that we have a few more folks on the line. If you'll just bear with me, I want to make sure I catch everything that you need to know. So first, we will be recording this webinar. Anyone that has registered will receive a recording after the event is over. So no need to worry about that. If you're trying to catch something, you will have a recording you'll be able to watch afterward. And you're welcome to obviously share it with any of your colleagues as well. When we get to the Q&A section at the end of the webinar, we will answer audience questions, but you don't need to wait to ask your questions. You're more than welcome to type them into the chat box as the webinar is going. We actually have a full team behind the scenes that will be helping to answer some of those questions in real time, and we'll also be compiling the most common questions for the panelists to ask at the very end. So again, please feel free to send those questions in as we're going through the process. Finally, we'll be following up with emails that contain more information and a link to the recording as well as to the updated insights report after this webinar is over. And finally, at the end of the webinar, you are going to see a very fast survey pop up. This won't take you more than a minute to complete, and we'd really love to hear your thoughts. So if you could just take a couple of moments and give us your feedback, that would be great, and we look forward to it. Okay, with that, we are going to jump right into the data report. So one of the things that I want to make sure is very clear to the audience members that are here today is that our employers, our higher ed partners, and our students all still want to connect. I think this is no surprise to anyone that is obviously here with us today or that has been experiencing what we've been going through. The connection piece is still really critical, and I think we're all trying to figure out what that's going to look like and how we can actually connect with each other. So that's one of the topics that we'll be talking about today. We were really thrilled that just a couple of weeks ago, we saw 1 million messages sent to students in a single week between employers and our students, and that was quite exciting. We know that 59% of our employers are increasing their digital engagement during this time. I think that's obviously not surprising. It's one of the core and only ways that people can interact. But what I want to emphasize here is that we're really hearing from many of our employers that even after COVID is over, they plan on continuing digital engagement in a really big way. And I know Walter's going to speak to some of that as we get into our panel. 73% of our college seniors are still searching for jobs during this time. For those of you that work in universities and at career centers, that's not necessarily again, surprising statistic. Even in normal times, you have a large chunk of students, particularly those that are interested in fields outside of iBanking, consulting, technology, that are typically still searching during the spring semester. However, with the state of the economy, that searching is going to look quite different this year. And finally, 69% of all of our students want their university career center to help them connect and to facilitate that communication with employers. That number actually jumps up to 74% when you're talking about the senior class this year. So as our career center partners are actually engaging with students, we really encourage you to make sure that the value add you have in these relationships with alumni and with employers is particularly critical, and we want to make sure that you're actually spending the time that you're meeting with students and helping to facilitate those connections and those introductions. Britt, you're welcome to go to the next slide. As you can tell, finding a job is increasingly becoming a top concern for students. More than 3 in 4 students say that getting a good job is in fact one of the top 3 concerns. The top one is, again, probably quite normal for many of you to see, especially those of you on university campuses. Family and physical health are tied in first place. That's been first and foremost on a lot of our students' minds, especially as they first left their college campuses and went home for the semester. That's quite important, as we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but many of our students, unfortunately, come from families that are being impacted by COVID-19 in some very different ways. Some of whom their family businesses are going under. They might be concerned about losing their jobs. They might be working in professions where they don't have the opportunity to work remotely. So the family and physical health piece is even more real for a large number of our students. And I don't know that we talk about that enough. So that's definitely something as a panel we're going to be addressing today. Mental health has been an increasing issue on many college campuses for quite some time. And with this particular pandemic, that continues to be a top concern for many students. But job search falls right in line right after that. And as we continue into the rest of the semester, we anticipate that that is going to become an increasingly important concern and worry for many of our students. Next slide. Students want to know which roles are open. Now, I think what's really interesting here is you see 2 different lines. You see the students who are confident about their job search, and you see the students who are unconfident about their job search. And still, you actually see the same trend lines across each of these different areas. Our students, whether they are confident or unconfident about the job search, they want to know what jobs and internships are still available so that they have their best opportunity to be able to go after those. They also want to be able to get personalized messages and updates from not only their career centers, but from employers directly. That is really important. And through a lot of our student research, not only in quantitative studies, but also in our focus groups where we're really getting into more in-depth conversations with students, they talk about what a difference that makes when they're actually receiving a personalized message from an employer. They are much more likely to actually apply or to consider a particular company when that happens. So I just want to call those two things out in particular. You can go to the next slide, Britt. I think this next slide is particularly interesting. I've been on a lot of media interviews recently, and people often ask the question about whether or not, what is this impact of COVID-19 going to have on our current students? And I always say that the silver lining to all of this is we're going to have a generation of students who are adaptable and who are agile and who will have grit. And I think you're seeing that as you look at some of the statistics here. We know that there's an increase in students who are willing to consider gig and remote work because they're watching what's happening and they're willing to adjust some of their expectations and they're willing to think a little bit differently about the opportunities that are in front of them. So I think this is particularly important. I think the other piece that the gig statistic really shows us is that students are acknowledging the fact that work might look quite different once we leave. I wrote an article a couple of years ago with my colleague Joe Testani where we talked about the future of work. And one of the things that we looked at was sort of the gig economy or the freelance economy, as many of you know. And at the time, there were predictions that by 2030, that the majority of people would actually, over 60% of people would actually be engaged in some type of gig or freelance work. Now, that didn't mean that they weren't also holding potentially a traditional 40-hour-a-week job, but the notion of gig work was really increasing in popularity. And I think a lot of our students are not only seeing that, they're understanding the benefits of what that could look like. And I think many of you who are both working at universities, but also here representing the companies you work for, you recognize that being able to do some project-based work has a lot of benefits, and you're starting to rethink the modules and the learning and the way in which you go about your tasks. So I think this will be an interesting topic for us as a panel to touch on as we get into the future-oriented section. Next slide. Don't worry, there are only a couple more slides left, I promise. This is something that I touched on briefly at the beginning. Our students want increased support from their universities. There is an expectation that they're going to be able to get help from their university career centers. We just released an updated insight report this morning stating that 99% of our students want their university career center to provide them support, especially during this time. And as I mentioned earlier, 69% of our students want help with facilitating connections and communication with employers. That number jumps up to 74% when we're talking about seniors. So again, very important for our university colleagues to make sure that you're using your connections and the relationships you have with alumni and with employers to actually facilitate those intros and to make sure that those connections are happening. Next slide. Thank you. Now, some of you on the employer end are wondering how students want to be reached out to. So I'm sharing with you some of these initial stats, but we're going to talk about this further with Rose and Will in particular when we get to the future-oriented section based on what they're hearing from their own student populations and what they're hearing from their colleagues across multiple types of institutions. We've split this out by seniors and all students. Obviously, you can see that many students are planning to do more networking in the coming weeks. Many are already starting to utilize the peer messaging function within Handshake to do so. They're planning on updating their online profiles, and they're planning to attend some virtual recruiting events. What I think is interesting here is I actually see that number, particularly around the virtual recruiting events, to go up significantly, especially for the seniors. As more and more of our university partners are pushing their students to actually engage virtually and to learn how to do so in a positive way, I think you're going to see more and more interest. So for the employers on the line, don't stop hosting the virtual recruiting events. I think, in fact, you're going to start to see more activity there. So that's a stat that I definitely think we will see some changes in the coming weeks. And finally, our last slide, Britt, please. How are employers reacting to COVID-19? I think this is quite interesting for our university partners who don't always have great insight into how employers might be making decisions and what some of their top priorities could be. What we learned at the onset of our survey is that the number one priority for all of our businesses is resetting their recruiting goals and expectations. And Walter's actually going to answer a question for us all later about what are some of the factors that go into how a company thinks about all of this. They also are thinking about building personal connections with candidates and really rethinking their recruiting process from top of funnel all the way to the end when they make an offer. What does that need to look like? And what are the ways that they're going to foster that personal connection? And then, of course, effectively reaching the students and training and actually equipping their team once they bring those individuals on are quite important for them as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, and we're going to kick off our conversation. Britt, you're welcome to remove the slides if you'd like. Great. Good morning, everyone. How are you?
Good morning, Christine.
Good morning,
Good morning.
Christine. Happy to be here.
Great to be here.
Excited to have each of you. Thank you. The first question I want to ask you is actually around the topic of access to diversity and inclusion. This is a popular topic that we hear from our employers. It's a popular topic that we hear across all institutions that are focused on inclusive excellence. And just in the past couple of days, we have started to see more news reports and media coverage on the fact that COVID-19 and this pandemic has differential impact across different populations of our society. And there are some students in particular that are really getting hit much harder, and the impact is much more severe for them than for the majority student. So Walter, I'm going to ask you first. It would be particularly helpful to know from your perspective, what are employers doing about this particular impact? Is there anything that Goldman Sachs or other employers that you've spoken with, how are they thinking about diversity and inclusion? How are they thinking about access? And what difference is this going to make in how they continue to make that a core priority for their recruiting?
Sure, it's a great question. I would say for Goldman Sachs specifically, but I suspect for employers broadly, that attracting and hiring students from all backgrounds and diverse groups, whether that's gender, ethnicity, or other factors, continues to be, if not more, critical to the long-term success of the firm. As we know, that drives innovation, it drives creativity, and ultimately, better solutions for our clients. So, that commitment and that view certainly has not changed, either before the beginning of the virus or, to where we are today and moving forward. What the current situation has impacted, though, I would say, is how we go about doing that. I think, as you touched upon a little bit, we pivoted very quickly to move all of our recruiting events to a virtual setting. And so, as we do that, we're excited to see that we have thousands of students that we're interacting with virtually. We have hundreds of virtual recruiting events to connect with students, either in small one-on-one settings or up to, larger events with several hundred attendees. But we're really focused on providing all students, but diverse groups included, the tools to be successful as they think about their careers moving forward. And that can take, different ways we can think about that in terms of what content to provide, whether it's skill-based learning or how to interview, how to pull together a resume. So as I mentioned, we're really excited that we've been able to move that content virtually. But as we move forward, we're also really excited to participate in forums like this, where we can get feedback from students, as well as directly, as we interact with students, to understand from them as we move to a more virtual environment, how are we doing? Are there ways that we could be more impactful, more helpful? Because while we appreciate, the ultimate objectives and how we're trying to empower students hasn't really changed, we may need to tweak, the way that we go about doing that and the types of information we provide. So we look forward to, continuing to get feedback and tweaking our approaches as we move forward.
That's great. Thank you, Walter. I appreciate hearing that perspective. Will, I'll ask you kind of a feeder off of this question. What are universities doing for students that are differentially impacted here? How are they ensuring that they still have access to opportunity, that they're still able to be successful?
I think, at least here at Rutgers, we have an partnership with different campus partners that work primarily with this population. So they have the cachet in order to actually get the students to participate and listen. And that's something that we've had to continually promote, not only pre-COVID, but now during this current COVID situation. So for example, we are hearing from employers that want to schedule virtual recruiting events for students of color as one example. But one of the challenges there is how do you attract those students in lieu of some of the diversity program that we were already offering on our campus? And so if they have virtual events, one of the things that we are able to do is connect with the offices that work with those students to encourage them still to attend. But students in general, especially from diverse backgrounds, they're dealing with so much right now. Pre-COVID, some of our students of color had concerns about unconscious bias. And now we have more employers that are moving toward the asynchronous video interviewing that can increase some of that anxiety for some of our students of color. You have students from different socioeconomic backgrounds that may not be able to afford to have the different types of technology readily available to them, especially if they live in a household where their brother or sister or even son or daughter has to utilize the same technology for their schools as well. International students is a big thing. We hosted a COVID workshop, job search booster workshop last night. And the majority of the questions that we received is, what is the hiring climate like for international students? We live in an environment right now where they are viewed as job stealers by government sources, some media agencies as well. And so from an employer standpoint, what can we do to help you tailor your messaging to those types of different populations to better attract them is going to be an important conversation that we continue to have moving forward.
That's great. Will, thank you for sharing that. I think some of those very concrete examples that you just provided are so important for us to talk about on a regular basis because they often get left out of many media reports or, quite frankly, even many panels and webinars that I know many of us have been on. Rose, I'm going to take this. I'm going to force you to look at this even from an even more broad perspective. Given what you just heard from Walter and from Will, what do you think we should all be doing right now? What could we be doing more of? How should we be rethinking our recruiting processes, our services, our programs, or the ways in which we are structured, or what our systems look like to be able to really address some of this inequity?
Yeah, this is such an important question and such a big issue. Thank you for that question. And for Walter and Will, both of you are weighing in here. I think that COVID-19, really prompted some things that have remained somewhat hidden. It's thrust this out into the open. And I think this issue of equity and diversity is a huge one. So I'm so glad we're focusing some time on it. I think at a very macro level, first, I'm not so much worried as an industry, as a career center, as a field that we're going to be innovative or adaptive. I think we're going to be able to do that to some extent. My greater concern is, are we going to be able to use foresight and use foresight decisively to make long-term decisions at all levels of our institution? And I think what I'm thinking about coming out of COVID for the work that we do to support students more equitably isn't, will I have a restored budget? Will I be able to hire? Yes, these are important causes to raise issue with, but a bigger issue in my mind is for many of us that have remained in this opt-in, opt-out model, where career education, access, social capital, these are things students have to seek out. And for campuses where that model is existing, where you're on the periphery of the undergraduate experience, you're not really embedded. And so therefore, this is where the inequity is really going to happen. And it existed pre-COVID, and now I think it's really laid to bear. And so in my mind, there's two things that need to happen. One is we need to be able to have a conversation about, is there an acknowledgement that a reset needs to happen here? And then if that conversation can happen, what incentives are there for organizations, higher ed, employers to really build systems out of this crisis that are going to be long lasting and serve all students? So I'll give you some examples of what we're seeing now. Normal spring quarter for us, it's a glide path to graduation. We have a handful of initiatives. Fall and winter is our busiest time for programming for students. We have a couple of career fairs, meetups, but by and large, this is a time where we're supporting students sort of path towards graduation. And so right when we hit COVID, we thought, well, let's move some of our programs virtual. Let's just flip that switch. And we did that with a virtual resume pro tip session. And for a campus of our size, it being a private Jesuit school, 5,500 students, we might see 50 students. And that is really a win in a normal economy. But what really quickly occurred to me when we did this is we did see 35 to 50 students, but that was really unacceptable. All of a sudden, it really occurred to me that, like you, Handshake, and Christine, that you've shared this report in your survey from students, 75% of the students at Santa Clara that we polled said that career support and connections was urgent for them, of all of the things that they're dealing with. And so all of a sudden, servicing just a really small percentage of our students is not acceptable anymore. And so now it's, well, what model can we, what strengths of our institution can we lean on immediately in the short term? And so what we've started to do is figure out how can we tap into broader networks, broader institutional networks quickly. And so we quickly mobilized to do away with our regular programming that we were going to do and to tap into our university LinkedIn network that has over 90,000 alums, students, parents, and we're doing these LinkedIn live sessions now where they're actively engaging our ecosystem. It's all of our students, it's our alums, different departments are chiming in comments box, adding resources for students. We need to be able to get out in front of students in a much more visible, urgent way. I think that's really comes to mind for me immediately in the short term. And then I think in the long term, as I think to going back to my own institution, it's going to be less about prioritizing resources for my unit, and it's going to be more about really, we need to let go of some of this tradition and be less in love with our tradition and more in love with what's best for students. And that means operating from a different model long term. So that's sort of what's top of mind for me.
I think that's right. So important and such a critical topic, I think, for all of us to think through. I think what's also important and what I love about our panel today is that we actually we're all partners in this, right? When we look at our students' access, when we think about the recruitment, our employers, our universities, technology partners, we all have a responsibility in how we think about those systems and what we can provide. And I know certainly at Handshake, we're quite committed to making sure that access for our students to all of these opportunities is first and foremost, and that we're thinking through that both with our employers and our universities and how to make sure that that reach and that scalability can actually happen. So let's definitely continue the conversation on that. I'm cognizant of time, and I want to make sure we get through many of our great questions here. So Walter, I'm going to ask you this next one. This sort of goes back to some of the data report that I had just shared at the beginning. I'm sure many of our university partners are getting questions from their students who are wondering about why employers might have to delay an internship, or why they might have to stop hiring, or why it took them so long for some of the employers to be able to switch to virtual. Could you give everybody a little bit more insight into what are the different types of factors employers have to consider when making these types of decisions?
Sure, it's a great question. I think maybe before answering, I'd first say we empathize, with students or professionals who are, in situations where, their future internship plans or employment plans, are looking a little bit different than they might have a few months ago. And so, first of all, we're trying to look at this from, a perspective of empathy and thinking how we can support people best in the environment. But, specifically to answer your question, I'd say there's really two ways that we think about this. And the first and really the most important is that, all decisions or approaches or changes that we think about are really driven by our focus on the physical and mental well-being of, our employees, our colleagues, clients, communities, including students that we engage with. So, top of mind for us is working with our medical partners, understanding what the risks are, particularly in an environment like this where it's challenging because it is so fluid. That can take time, but it's very important to us, again, to always be acting from the perspective of what's best from a physical and mental well-being perspective, of those groups. So that's, I think, kind of our guiding principle. But then secondly, we're also looking at, whether it's internship opportunities or, forward-looking recruiting programs from an angle of the employee or intern experience. We want to make sure that whatever we do, is helpful, is providing the tools that I'd mentioned for people to be successful long-term. And we appreciate that, some people learn in different ways. Some people are more open to virtual type programs than others, or some, as Will said, may have different access to technology than others. Some people, may experience or do better in case study situations versus, other types of learning. And we also, realize there's different student preferences, within those contexts. And so, as you can imagine, there's a lot of time being, spent on thinking through the different kind of scenarios. What could we provide? How would we provide it? What kind of technology is required? And so while I can appreciate from a student's perspective, sometimes it may seem like it's taking longer than people might want it to for a decision to be made, and completely understand that sentiment. We'd like to people to understand that ultimately we're just trying to be very thorough, finding that right balance between physical and mental health, as well as providing great experience for our interns and new analysts that join the firm.
That's great. Walter, can I actually ask you a quick follow-up? I am making an assumption, but I assume that when you bring on interns for your virtual internship, or if they need to onboard remotely for a full-time position, that you all are sending any needed resources to those particular individuals, whether that be equipment or software or things that they might need to be able to do their job and their tasks. I was recently asked by a reporter if I felt like that was a responsibility of all employers to be able to ensure that those types of resources are given to their interns. And I'm curious, from an employer point of view, would that be a call to action that you would encourage other employers to do the same as what you all have done there?
Well, I'd say if you look at it from the perspective of, the way that we view our internship programs, our primary pipelines for full-time recruiting, have people after a summer internship to convert and rejoin us the following year as a new analyst. And as I mentioned earlier, we see, that talent as being critically important to the long term of the success. So, from that perspective, the intern's success is our success. And so we want to make sure that they're, positioned for that and have a great program experience. So as you could imagine with the situation, there's a lot of contingency planning, thinking about what do people need in order to be successful. And, that there are certain pieces of that we're still working through, but that's our ultimate goal, is to provide the tools that people need to be successful.
That's great. Wonderful. Will, I'm going to ask you a question. Many employers who are hiring right now are asking the question of, how do students want to be communicated with? What should be the cadence of that communication? They recognize that many students are getting many emails at this particular point in time. And so they want to make sure that their messages are not getting lost in the shuffle. What are you hearing from your students or from other institutions?
I think in general, the more tailored approach that you can take with a student, the better. You certainly don't want to spam them, because students will just, turn off. Or you got to also keep in mind, when you're thinking about email in and of itself, they're also being inundated with emails from their higher ed institutions regarding coursework or other things. One of the things that I am happy to see is the increased utilization of the Handshake messaging platform. Because students know that those messages are coming from employers that are interested in them. But the more employers can tailor their approach, instead of reaching out to every single student that may or may not really meet your qualifications or your hiring criteria, be as tailored as possible. And that's what we hear from students in general when it even comes to our own marketing within career services, that I think also applies to employers.
Great. Thank you, Will. Appreciate the concreteness in that. Rose, for employers that are on the line today that perhaps unfortunately can't hire right now, but recognize the importance of building their early talent pipeline and what that's going to do for their companies long term, what advice would you have for them around how they can still build their brand or their awareness with students, even if they don't have open positions right now? What should they do?
Yeah, I love this question. I think one of the lessons learned from the 2008 recession from employers was if and when they pulled back, and the extent that damaged their brand long term when they pulled away from college campuses. And I think, to me, the most important thing is that students really need to know how important they are to the future of your organization. And I don't know that students always understand how much thought and pain and love goes into building internship programs, and how difficult it is for recruiters to have to pull away from those. And so I think for students, one, to understand how much of a priority they are, and how you can do that first and foremost with internships that are currently in the works, is to be as transparent as you can, even if things are on hold or postponed. I actually believe, I know there's a lot of communication coming to our students, but the more they could hear from you personally about the status of their offer or the status of their future, students want that. So there's no, too much is not too much when it comes to students feeling that you're important. Another thing, Will, and Walter, actually, that you brought up, I love the skills-based learning. I think we saw this coming out of the Great Recession, where employers and recruiters can actually be partners, an extension of a career center in terms of offering support for labs, workshops, AMAs. Please, when and how you can do that virtually, we would welcome that with open arms, because the credibility that you bring and your insights will really power students' confidence and self-efficacy. I think the other low-hanging fruit that I would say to definitely leverage is the alumni network. So for organizations that have alums from different institutions that work for you, can you leverage those alums as an extension of your recruiting teams to actually be doing some of this mentorship? Maybe an executive in residence or professional in residence that's an alum that will represent your brand, so that long-term students can still form those emotional connections to your brands that you know that you want to help maintain.
Excellent advice. Thank you so much, Rose. You said something at the beginning of your answer that I'm going to totally play off of. Walter, what did you learn from the recession of 2008? That you are taking with you and that you have used in this particular situation? And are there new lessons that you have already learned just in the past couple of months from this pandemic?
It's a great question. I think the first thing I would say, I would echo what Rose had said, is I think as an industry, financial services learned in 2008 the importance of focusing on your brand and connecting with students from a long-term perspective, and the negative impact not going to campus a particular year or reducing significantly those opportunities for connectivity can have on your brand longer term. And so, for certainly Goldman Sachs and I imagine most other firms are committed now to continuing to interact with students, provide opportunities to connect, try to be helpful in building skill sets and helping people feel prepared moving forward. So I would say I think that's one of the big lessons learned that I hope is guiding firms in how they approach this now. The second one is I think we've all learned to pivot very quickly and be flexible while keeping our mind and focus on the overall objective and strategy of promoting opportunities to as wide and diverse a group of people as possible, but having to do that in a very different way than when we envisioned and we're putting together our plans for the spring several months ago. So I'd say that's the other thing that we've experienced over this last couple months, is the importance of being flexible, being able to pivot while keeping in mind, the overall objective of thinking about how we can be helpful to students through partnering with career centers and other folks.
Absolutely. Will, when you think about the future and you think about us going into the fall semester, obviously we're still going to be very much in COVID land. I don't know that we will be post-COVID by the fall. What do you see as sort of sticking around? What are some of the lessons that we've learned while we have been here in sort of our shelter in place, work from home situations that you believe are actually going to thoroughly disrupt or transform the way in which recruiting is done, whether from a university perspective or from a student or employer perspective? What do you think will stay virtual? What do you think will actually go back to being in person?
Yeah, I was going to say the whole virtual aspect in and of itself, for years within career services, we talk a lot about meeting students where they're at. But many of our staff have kind of been slow to become more comfortable with whether it's a virtual appointment or a virtual program or the LinkedIn Live sessions. Well, now we are getting a crash course in this, and I think more and more our staff are becoming more comfortable doing this type of stuff. But our students are going to expect this as well. Even if COVID was not a thing right now, or let's say everything was completely okay in the fall and no one had a concern in the world about attending large events and so forth. At the end of the day, you still have commuter students, for example, that may not be able to come out to a program because that means driving 30 minutes or an hour to come to a career office and doing something there. Virtual career fairs, I think many of us right now are feeling the pain of potential revenue loss from our in-person career fairs, and what is that going to mean for us in the future. So looking at diversifying your portfolio, that's something that's going to stick with a lot of career services offices when it comes to income. These things are not going to go away. And in a way, you know, we surveyed our staff during a staff meeting. We asked them, what is one thing that they think will come out of this that's more positive in nature? And everyone said being forced to utilize technology, being forced to really truly understand how all these online tools and vendors work was something that they were seeing as a positive that will come out of this. And I think that's something that's going to continue with us into the fall semester, even if COVID-19 was no longer an issue.
So interesting to hear. Well, I didn't know you were going to say that, but it made me actually think about a comment that we got from a partner recently who was saying, you know, I don't know that enough of our team actually knows the way in which Handshake was intended to work and how you can actually utilize it to its fullest capacity. And I thought that was really interesting because until this particular point in time, many were not forced to actually think about technology fully in that way, or how it could actually partner to enhance the work that we were doing. So that's quite interesting. Now, Rose, I think given everything that oh yeah, go ahead, Will.
I was going to say, one thing that I will highly recommend for career services offices, you know, as we're trying to figure out how this is all going to work and from a projection standpoint, you can analyze your own posting data. You can look to see if there's a decrease from week to week regarding new postings in the system. And that can help you figure out what the trend could be. And all the information that Handshake is sharing right now, I have to say it's wonderful. And it's helping everyone to think differently about what opportunities are in their systems and how to communicate that to students.
Thank you, Will. I appreciate that. And just for those of you that are on the line that happen to be our partners, we are currently working on an in-product dashboard for our universities so that you know specifically who is hiring at your institution and you're able to pull that data quickly, not only to help your students as directly as possible, but so that you can share that information with your senior leadership and so that you know where you might not be seeing opportunities. You can reach out to those employers as well. Rose, given what you've heard from everybody's comments and conversations, I know you've also been part of multiple webinars and panels as well. There's a lot of talk about the future. There's a lot of talk about what's to come. But for you as a leader, how do you make a decision about when it's time to stop talking and start doing? What are the factors you're looking for? And when do you start to make that pivot towards actually acting on all of this?
What a great question, Christine. And I will just say very candidly that I still think that we are building the plane as we're flying it at the same time. I think all of us feel that way. So to some extent, we're building as we're doing right now. We have to be. But I think the long-term piece is such a compelling question. Will, thank you so much for raising this idea of diversifying your portfolio. I couldn't agree more with that. And I think that if we can look at a spectrum of high touch, high tech, and at scale, how do we find the sweet spot? How we're reaching students more broadly and more equitably. That's something that we've been grappling with pre-COVID, and I think we'll continue to do that. What I would say is what we're looking at, and this is really interesting if you track from 2008, I always like to look at shifts and patterns and break in code to be able to get a better sense of what might be emerging new needs that are being unmet or new needs that we need to be able to address. And in the 2008 recession, what we saw happening was this emergence of these executive education firms that were really filling this gap of helping build students' readiness, work readiness, as employers were putting more pressure on higher ed to produce graduates that could hit the ground running. And so now what I'm seeing, which is super fascinating, and I think it's keeping an eye on these trends and then figuring out what your role is to take action, is the sort of looking at the social structured networks that I think are going to be a greater part of our future. And so what I mean by that is if you look at in this crisis where action and who is taking action, these are these networks that are kind of being built from the ground up. So if you look at URX, which is a group of early talent recruiters in the Bay Area, they've built TalentBoard.io, and it's really fascinating. It's a way for students to fill out their profile to get directly in front of recruiters. Students whose internships have been canceled, and it's recruiters building this out of empathy for students in this very challenging situation they've been in. Or if you look on the other side of things, there's an alum, a recent alum from one of the major public institutions in California that's building a platform that's really about servicing students who have barriers to success. And he is a testament of failure. He talks about how he got rejected from multiple schools, rejected from multiple employers, and now he's building this empire around the underdog. And so many of our students are resonating with this message. And it's this grassroots entrepreneurial approach to having students feel like there's someone that shares their experience that they can relate to and who has influence on their future and their self-efficacy. So I think about that, and those are the things that I'm watching for. And that is what prompts me to think that some of the models that we're in, we may need to revisit those. Which models and systems are broken, which may need to be rebuilt to better serve students when there's these emergence of these new trends, because I do think it speaks to larger, broader issues. Right now, for us, what we're doing is planning for multiple scenarios in the fall. So I think it's going to be some element of virtual, hybrid, and then in person. And how do we toggle back and forth between the two things? But ultimately, it's going to be, I think, Will, you raised it really well, this comfort with technology. All Career Center staff now need to be comfortable with putting themselves out there and new ways to tap into networks. I think our educational ecosystem, Handshake, each other, employers, we really do need to work together to solve these problems. And so I think that's never been more clear to me now.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rose. We're going to actually turn to some of our audience questions. We're seeing a lot coming in, and I want to make sure we make some time for that. Walter, this first one's going to be for you. As we look into the fall semester, which we know is normally a very big recruiting time, and I imagine for those that are still hiring will continue to be so, what will employers be doing in place of on-campus recruiting or on-campus career fairs? And what can university career centers do to accommodate your needs? And again, you can speak to that from a Goldman Sachs perspective, but also what you've heard from other employers, and I'm happy to tack on to that as well.
Sure, it's a great question. I certainly at Goldman Sachs, but I imagine at other employers as well, we're looking at all different kind of scenarios. I think, Will touched upon it a little bit. Unfortunately, none of us have a crystal ball. We don't know what the ongoing impact of COVID-19 will be and to what extent. And so I think we're thinking through different scenarios, whether maybe it's some on-campus programming with virtual, programming complementing that, or all virtual programming, or it's hard to imagine all on-campus programming, but we're thinking about through the different scenarios, but again, with the view of how can we be most helpful to students and, career centers and our other university stakeholders. We're starting to test some of those, methods out now in the spring to understand, from a student's perspective, what type of content is most helpful, what mediums do they like to consume the content, whether that's through social media or webinars or whatever that might be. And so we're still trying to figure some of that out, to be honest. What would be, I think, super helpful for employers, is a very kind of open dialogue with career centers, because we really look to our partners, at universities to get a sense of the pulse of the students that they represent in terms of what they would find most helpful, how we can be helpful in partnering, whether it is, to Rose's point, bringing in subject matter experts from our businesses to help educate students, or recruiting 101s or whatever it might be. But we're really keen to get feedback from students in terms of what they find would be most helpful, whether that's through the career centers, through sessions like today, through research that Handshake and others are publishing in terms of student preferences, or direct feedback. So we really look forward to just having very frank and maintaining close partnerships with our university partners to really understand what would be most helpful, both from a content and also a kind of delivery perspective.
That's great. Thank you, Walter. That's definitely in line with a lot of our conversations with employers, certainly those that partner with Handshake as well. I think one of the things that I would want to make sure folks on the line know is that through a lot of our conversations, we're hearing employers that have been wanting to move towards virtual engagement for some time now. And the pandemic in many ways just sped that up. It sped up years of that movement into essentially a compressed month or so. And as they go through that effort in training their teams, in really learning the technology themselves and figuring out what works with students, there's a desire to keep a good number of those techniques and strategies in place, even when we are able to all be in person again. And so certainly for our university career centers, I urge you to get comfortable with the technology. and to get comfortable with the fact that many of your employers would actually like to be able to continue virtual engagement. And it's not just because I think sometimes universities worry that it's because they feel lazy or they don't want to interact with the students or they want to do it the easy way. But in fact, what I'm hearing from employers is that it's not necessarily easier. It's because they want to be able to let their dollars stretch as far as possible. Our employers also struggle with tightened budgets, just as our universities do. And when they're trying to meet their hiring targets, they have to think about ways that they can diversify their techniques. To sort of Will's point, it's sort of the parallel. They need to think about diversification of their portfolio and their techniques. And they need to think about how they can increase access to more students and to more diverse students across multiple institutions. And that's a really important piece. And I know at least here at Handshake, we're starting to really engage in that conversation around virtual engagement. What can we do in terms of building out a virtual fair experience that's modern and that meets the needs and the value for our employers and our students and our universities, but also a larger virtual engagement suite as we think about virtual interviews, as we think about virtual connections, conversations, communication between employers and students and what that can look like. So certainly, Walter, you'll be part of those conversations, but we know many of the employers that are on this call today will be as well. So appreciate that. Thank you. The next question is, what are your recommendations or experiences with respecting and prioritizing students' family and health concerns above their concern for finding a job? How do you communicate this to leadership? And what do we need to support the students holistically? I'm going to give that question. To Will, and I'm going to admit that as I read the question, I think the key term there is holistically, because I actually don't know that we need to prioritize family and health needs above their career needs. I think it's recognizing that they're all interconnected is at least how I look at some of that data. But Will, I'd be curious your perspective.
I think the key is partnerships. I'm part of a student success committee here at Rutgers, and it includes not only career services personnel, but personnel from student affairs that deal with health and wellness. We also have members who deal with issues of diversity and inclusion, academic support as well. If there is a way that we can communicate to students all of the different resources that are available to them in a more holistic manner, I think that does allow students to see themselves not necessarily within these little pieces of what we consider, whether it's career preparation or academic support and so forth. And I think that's important. It's all about the messaging. Overall, we have to let students know that we are here for them and that we care, and not just regarding their professional preparation. If there's anything that we can do, by partnering with some of our other campus partners to communicate that message more holistically, I think the better. But that's a difficult question because everyone's situation is going to be unique. I was like, thanks, Christine, for giving me that one. but it is one of those things where I really do truly believe that the more that you can partner with people on campus to communicate your message holistically, the better.
I can actually, if you don't mind, jump in, Will, because I love this idea of this holistic. It was a great question from our audience. And one thing that I think we're trying to do at Santa Clara, which might help to bridge the silos of approaching mental illness in these segments, is we're going to do a call campaign with our students, but it's going to be across campus. So I'll have a script and I'm going to ask and check in with students about a myriad of things, not just their career, how they're doing, how their families are doing, what they need to support with related to academics and career. And so I think if everyone on campus can have a chance to ask these questions, it doesn't matter where you sit in the institution, that it's really everyone's business to make sure our students are set up for success. I think that could be one way to approach it holistically, at least in the short term.
Great, thank you, Rose. I know a few other institutions are doing something similar as well. I'm not sure if others are taking the holistic sort of perspective in the way that they're asking the questions, though. So I think it's quite helpful to hear how you plan on approaching that at Santa Clara. The next question, Walter, I'm going to give to you. The question is, how do employers want to be communicated with? How can we at Career Centers help support and engage with employers? And how can we continue to improve that type of support? And then part of the question is related to how Handshake can also support Career Services view of that better relationship management as well. So I'll take that part of the question. But Walter, first to you, how do employers want to be communicated with from Career Centers?
Sure, that's a great question. I mean, I think part of it is going back to our earlier conversation about we really value and look to our, partners in the career centers to be, advocates for their students and to, provide information on what they think would be most helpful for their students. So I think, again, just open and frank dialogue is super helpful, and we appreciate that very much. In terms of thinking about it from a more kind of tactical or execution perspective, I think while we're always happy, and I suspect other employers are always happy to talk about, events in 2 weeks or 2 months from now, it's also super helpful to know what the longer term strategic goals of a particular university's career center are, because then that gives us an opportunity to think about, like, how can we provide value and help you achieve your strategic goals as well. And some, often with strategic goals, there are things that can take, 6 months to a year or tend to be kind of longer term in range. And so we just encourage, and we would, love to be part of not only, discussions around the next season and what events are taking place and, all the logistics around those type of things, but what are the larger kind of longer term goals of a particular career center, so that we can think about how we can partner best with you to, help ideally meet those.
I love that, Walter. I don't think we hear that enough from employers that I know who want that, but don't always articulate that it's not just about the tactical and practical events or programs or immediate things coming up, but truly for our career center partners to be thinking strategically about what their goals are and to make sure that that's communicated. Thank you so much for kind of honing in on that. I do want to do a quick follow-up here. If there are any universities that are not currently a partner with an organization, such as Goldman Sachs or any of the other employers that might be on the line, what's the best approach or way for a university to begin that partnership or to begin that outreach? What would cause you to actually answer their email or their phone call? Is there anything they could do to stand out?
Sure. Well, I'd like to think that we're responsive when new partners do reach out to us. So I just encourage you to continue to do that through whatever network or forum is most easy for you. I'm on LinkedIn. If people who don't already have connectivity to our firm in particular, feel free to reach out. And so, yeah, like as I said, I hope we're being communicative and responsive to those that we already partner with. But if there are new universities, we're always looking as a firm to expand our reach in terms of how we are able to connect with students. So we encourage, others to reach out if that would be of interest, and we'll try to get back to you.
Wonderful. And I'll take the last question really quickly. There was a question, and I know we need to wrap up on time, so I want to be sensitive to that. The question was, how can Handshake help to continue to facilitate stronger relationships between universities and employers? And this is one topic that I'm particularly passionate and quite interested in. Earlier this year, we started some different design activities with some of our university directors. I know Rose and Will were actually both part of some of these design sessions, and we'll actually be continuing these conversations throughout the year, where we wanted to bring together a mixed group, so Handshake, university partners, as well as employers, to think through how can we really leverage and bring together all three sides of the ecosystem in Handshake in some really unique and creative ways. And what came out of that were some really amazing ideas, one of which is actually going to land in our roadmap later this year and going into 2021. So I don't want to make any promises for our product team, for those of you that are listening, don't worry. But we will be adding it to our roadmap, and we're going to be thinking about ways in which we can actually automate. For those of you in the university system, you're familiar with a gap analysis. We want to be able to use the information that we have from your students in their profiles to tell us, what are they interested in? What industries, what roles, where do they want to work? What does that look like? And obviously, since we're sitting on a lot of data and we're able to tell you who actually recruits at your institution right now, we'd be able to pinpoint for you, where do you have those relationships already existing? Great job. And where might you have some gaps and might be missing? And then based on that, based on our network, we would be able to help connect you to those employers so that you could start to forge some of those relationships. So obviously this is very high level. It's quite abstract at the moment as we sort of think through the initial stages of that. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a sneak peek for those of you that are on the webinar today so that we can continue to foster those types of relationships between our universities and our employers. We know that's quite important for all of you in attaining your goals. With that, I want to thank each of our panelists, Will, Rose, Walter. Thank you so much for being with us today. You gave lots of great expertise and nuggets of wisdom. I know many of our participants are going to go back and use that information immediately for their organizations, their companies, or their institutions. And for those of you that are on the line, thank you for joining us today. As I close, you will see a quick survey pop up, and we hope that you will take a moment to give us your thoughts. With that, have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, Christine.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.